going forward. Because I think critically that 10 years ago, the main intellectual problem was to wrap our minds around the fact to even see that what was happening was Wikipedia, not Encarta. Cooperation, not just improved competition. 5 years ago, the big debate was, is it real, is it here to stay, or will it die? I think today we need to be able to begin to look forward and say, okay, let's assume cooperation, how do we build it? But the battle isn't completely won, and so we need a word from this man. So this is Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, responding after the crisis. Here's a classic exchange between the chairman of then a House of Representatives committee and Alan Greenspan.
You have been a staunch advocate for letting markets regulate themselves. My question for you is simple.
Do you have more volume?
Yes. I found a flaw.
This is too good to give up. Do you have more volume here?
You have been a staunch advocate for letting markets regulate themselves. And my question for you is simple. Were you wrong?
Yes. I found a flaw, but I've been very distressed by that fact.
You found a flaw in the reality.
In the model that I perceive is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right.
That's precisely the reason
I had a model that said the world works in a certain way and it was wrong. If you missed it, here's the certificate.
I made a mistake presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others.
I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations were such that they were best capable of protecting their shareholders. No exchange better captures a moment that is still not entirely appreciated, I think, of transition. There sits a man who is responsible for 20 years governing the American economy, says, my model that was built on self-interest and our ability to design systems for self-interest was wrong. And it led to a collapse. We're beginning to forget that lesson, but that lesson is critical and comes to be embedded in a whole set of ways of looking at the world, from industry through social organization and politics, and all the way back to the net. So the classic case is not entirely new. At the turn of the 20th century, Frederick Taylor invented the idea of scientific management, the idea that we would study each movement. And the problem with each worker is you study each movement, you standardize it, you monitor, and you reward and punish if they don't do. Why? Because otherwise people just sit around having lunch, otherwise they won't work. Oliver Williamson, up there with the Economic Institutions of Capitalism, got a Nobel Prize in economics for work whose core statement was that the reason we have firms is because they are better at controlling shirking. They're better at controlling self-interest. Because everyone, from the worker to the mid-level manager to the CEO, is out for themselves. And so you need monitoring of the workers, monitoring of the mergers, and the CEO at the top has to get stock options so that the CEO and the shareholders feel the same. All coming from the same view that essentially the best way to understand people and predict them is to imagine them as completely self-interested. General Motors was in many senses built in that way. But about 30 years ago, the beginnings of a critique came through when Toyota, I know it's a bad idea to talk about Toyota's success now, but let's not forget that for 30 years they were a major model of industrial production. Here's what's relevant about them here. They went in 1980 into one of General Motors' worst performing plants, with 20% absenteeism and employees who couldn't stand coming to work. They shut it down for 2 years, and they reopened it 2 years later with almost all the same workers, all the union leadership, all in agreement with the employees. Instead of having 70 engineers sitting and taking measurements of who people were doing, there was 0 shop floor engineers. Instead of each person standing at their point, there were teams of 4 or 5 who were continuously exchanging places and trying to innovate. The supply chain relations, instead of just saying, we don't believe the suppliers, you have to compete with each other, and every time we'll compete in bids, much longer term trust relationships, and very different executive compensation model. So this is, by the way, the images of Toyota's CEO and GX CEO scaled for their compensation in 2006. What you had were 2 systems that coherently executed a more collaborative view and a more individualist view, all the way from the top to the bottom of a hierarchical firm versus one that built more on cooperative relationships. What we found, in fact, is that firms that used stock options had higher levels of fraud because people were still trying to find ways. Firms that had more competitive bidding with suppliers did worse, and then throughout these systems, the firms that were more collaborative did better. But it's not only business. In the 1970s, the United States went through a period of major urban collapse and increasing crime. And one of the 2 major responses to this was 3 strikes and you're out. Let's have very powerful sanctions. Let's put people in prison forever, more or less. Gary Benkler, another Nobel laureate in economics, tried to explain crime in terms of rational self-interest. You look at the benefit of the crime and the probability of the punishment, and the size of the punishment times the probability, and it's just like buying any item. You either buy the thing or you steal it based on the probabilities. Of course, if that's how you look at it, you just raise the penalties. And we've got massive penalties and no evidence since then to assure that in fact they help. But there's another way as well. In the 1980s, starting in Chicago and generalizing throughout most of the communities in the United States with over 50,000 people today, we've seen adoption of community policing. And it's not just nice words. This is a different system in different components. It starts at the technical level, people walking or biking, not in the car, so that there's an immediate connection with the community. It's organizational. Instead of just emergency calls, you're there all the time, you're there periodically with specialists who communicate with the community. Instead of no discretion and very clear procedures, a lot more discretion for the police officers, and social. Strong efforts of humanization, both of the police officers to the communities that are heavy in crime, and of the communities heavy in crime, instead of seeing everyone as victims or perpetrators, but more seeing as people in the neighborhood. There's been tremendous success with community policing in the United States, and it is one of the 2 major success stories. The other one is more data-driven and administrative, and it's also been effective. But there's widespread acceptance that community policing has been successful. What I want to suggest to you is that all of these shifts during this period, including the shift from the Britannica model to the Wikipedia model, the one that is most familiar to us as digital culture, are the same. They are shifts from models that assume universal self-interest, organized around everybody wanting to get money, around property that closes and forces people to cooperate, as it were, to models that are open, to models that are based on mutual trust, to models that are based on models of solidarity, to cooperative models, and that we see them not only online, but also offline. But what's happened in the last decade, as more and more of our online lives are infused with this ethical cooperation, is that it's become easier to see this fact. So cooperative human systems refers to an integrated approach, technical, organizational, institutional, and social, that is based on the best evidence that we have from the real world, as well as from basic social and behavioral science, And the thing that's fascinating is I started in the last 4 or 5 years to read in multiple disciplines to see this, is that this recognition has been emerging across disciplines as diverse as evolutionary biology and neuroscience, to sociology, not surprising, psychology, anthropology, management science. Across all of these domains, we've seen a gradual move from the periphery to the core of an understanding that the dominant model that Alan Greenspan talked about has been wrong for a very long time. It's just taken us a very long time to understand it, and we still don't fully understand it. Let me give you just a couple of examples, not because evolution is critical and I'm making the claim that we are this way evolutionarily, but because it provides such a powerful statement in something as basic as a scientific discipline of this change. So in 1976, one of the world's leading biologists, Richard Dawkins, wrote, "Be warned that if you wish, as I do, to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously and unselfishly towards a common good, you can expect little help from biological nature. Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." 30 years later, another eminent biologist writing in the journal Science concludes his review of the discipline as it stands 30 years later thus: "Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of evolution is its ability to generate cooperation in a competitive world. Thus, we might add natural cooperation as a third fundamental principle of evolution beside mutation and natural selection." That's a big difference within a discipline that is fundamental science and supposedly uses a series of methods that is about as fundamental and stable as we can. It replicates an old battle. Herbert Spencer was the person who actually introduced survival of the fittest and social Darwinism as a social interpretation of Darwinism. But already 100 years ago, 110 years ago, Kropotkin published Mutual Aid, not as a political piece, but as a natural science piece describing his travels in Siberia, looking at natural cooperation. For the last century, most of the debates between evolution and selfishness and not in evolution have been not by people like Kropotkin trying to use nature, but people saying it's not about nature, it's about society, it's about culture, it's about nurture. What we've seen in the last decade is an increasing set of studies that uses techniques from biology and neuroscience to say we are in fact this way. So these are images, for example, from a paper by Singer et al. That are showing empathy existing in the brain. What does that mean? They take couples, they shock one but not the other, and they show that the person not being shocked lights up in their brain in almost identical places. They in fact feel their pain. Work on voles and later on human beings suggesting the relationship between trust and long-term bonds and particular neural agents. Again, my point at this point is not to tell you this is how we are, nature says it. It's to express to you the difference that has occurred in this discipline between where it was 30 years ago and where it is today, as we're beginning, and in some sense we use science today in the way that in many cases people use religion, as a way of understanding our place in the world, in a secular modern world. And that is beginning to talk in the language that we're talking. We see things in psychology, in sociology, and anthropology. Perhaps the next best thing we have to just a simple self-interested model is to imagine ourselves as being pulled in different measures, in different directions by vectors. We care about material self-interest. Sure, we need to eat, but we also have emotional responses to situation. We also have social understandings of what we are, what the relationships are, what's appropriate for the situation, and we also have a real concern with moral considerations. And each of these push us and pull us in different directions. The embarrassing thing about saying this to an audience is that we all know this. This is how we were raised. The problem is that we've spent 40 years worth of social science and serious political theory, serious economics, trying to unlearn that basic truth so that we can create rational policy. But in fact, we need to relearn the opposite. We need to make a conceptual move, understanding that rationality does not equal universal self-interest expressed in material terms. Rather, we have diverse motivations that don't always line up, and that pro-social humanity is everywhere, but is subject to context, and sometimes it can be more self-interested and sometimes less. It requires a certain attitude to design that needs to be realistic based on our actual behavior in the world, and it has to be evidence-based, and it needs a lot of disciplines. And in terms of politics, it means something quite fundamental. For a very long time, and maybe it's not been so powerful in Brazil, it certainly has been powerful in the US, it certainly has been powerful in Europe. There's this idea that fairness and ethics can be separated from productivity and growth. That you have to solve productivity and growth, and then you can do tax and redistribution. What turns out as we look carefully in experimental settings, in careful observations, is that that's simply false. You cannot separate ethics, you cannot separate fairness, you cannot separate empathy and solidarity from the very act of being more productive, more creative. You need to integrate the two into the same political system. So that leaves us with the question of how we begin to systematize all of this work into something like cooperative human systems design. And I'll try to give you a few examples, both from experiments and from online platforms, for how this might work. The building blocks are communication, as well as framing of the situation, empathy and solidarity, definitions of what is right, fair, and normal, calculation, both material and social relationships. But the critical thing to see here is that you can't just add money to an interaction and expect it to become better. You can't leave a check on the table at the end of a social dinner and expect to be invited again more often. It doesn't work that way. And that's really problematic for the standard economic model. Because if it is the case that when you add money to an activity, for some people you get less of the activity, you've completely messed things up for the model of how you build, say, property or incentives or anything like that. And a variety of other social dynamics, and I focus specifically on trust. So discussion. So communication, we all know what this means. Let me just focus on one thing. One of the things that happens is humanization. So here's a discussion about the elections, about George Bush election, something like that. And then look at there, somebody is there who writes, What are you doing when you write, You can't read without hearing the human being on the other side. You have to sound it out to yourself. What we do, the first thing we do in communication is saying, I'm a human being here across from you. If you look, say, at Yahoo's developer network advice to building social software, the first statement is, talk like a person. Talk like a person. One of the things we lost in thinking about the world as incentives and rational action was the idea that it didn't matter what you said, it didn't matter how you communicated, it was all about the payoffs. Talk was cheap, talk isn't cheap, it's a central part of who we are. So for example, if you look at litigation versus mediation, a move within law to create a more collaborative problem solving, completely different model of communication, flat, non-hierarchical, open expression rather than much more structured. The second thing you need to do is framing. And this is really problematic, but let me start with the story. There's a beautiful set of experiments run by experimental psychologists that they basically run prisoner's dilemmas game. There's a standard little experiment that basically has a unique prediction in game theory that everybody will defect and no one will cooperate. In practice, in actual experiments, when you actually put people in these situations, people do cooperate some of the time. What they did here was they took exactly the same game with exactly the same incentives and ran it in different populations. But for some of the people, they told them they were playing the Wall Street game. And for others of the people, they said, you're playing the community game. It turns out that when people were told they were playing the community game, 70% of them started cooperating and kept cooperating over the game. When they were told it was the Wall Street game, 30% started cooperating and cooperation declined over the course of the game. Now, here's what's beautiful about this and here's what's dangerous about this. What's beautiful about this is that we are able to adapt how we behave to what we understand the situation to be. If the situation is a cooperative one, then we cooperate. At least many of us do, the majority. If the situation is not cooperative, one where it's just fine to look out for yourself, that's what we do. Many of us are malleable in that way, and we can adjust to different situations. What that means is that we need to learn how to build systems for a society, most of whose members, but not everyone, is actually cooperative. The problem is, what you know, you've all come across a company that says, we're a community of this and that. Whatever it is, we're a community. The problem is authenticity. And that's not at all trivial. But at least it's important to understand that if you can authentically create a cooperative situation, then you don't need to monitor and reward or punish because people do it from the inside. Empathy is another important component. We travel, we go, we sit, we eat, we hang out with each other. We are able to understand, we don't only look at our own things, we look at what's is what with the other. And we can do that online as well with profiles, with people basically showing their faces. Face-to-face turns out to be an enormously powerful intervention, for example, in experiments to avoid self-interested behavior. Solidarity, I guess I don't need to talk about that here, but one of the things that's very clear, and again, we find this experimentally when we look at experimental settings, people behave differently when they see themselves as part of a team, as part of an identity. People are willing to sacrifice and not work for themselves. But this also emphasizes the fact that cooperation, we code it positive, but it could be very negative. Because cooperation just means not self-interested. It doesn't mean nice. It doesn't mean moral. It could mean, I will sacrifice myself to kill you from the other group. Cooperation is something that's true for us, but it's not necessarily nice. It's a cultural adaptation, as it were, for us to be able to think of it as nice, because we also care about being nice and doing what's fair. But it needs to be managed carefully, particularly solidarity. It doesn't have to be organic, it can be created. This is one of my favorites from a few years ago. One of the top teams of contributors to SETI at Home were the Knights Who Say Me. That is to say, the reference to these guys from Monty Python, who had their own website and talked about it, and were all contributing to collaborative computing. No less important is that we care about doing what's right, what's fair, and also just what's normal. Most normal people, most of the time when you actually measure it, will be taught to doing what they think is the right thing to do under the circumstances. We see this used online a lot, this codes of honor. Obviously, Wikipedia is the most largest scale example of an organization that heavily relies on self-created and asserted norms. And if you'll have debates, this is in the context of evolution, this is a debate over creationism. What you see when you dig into debates about what people really care about, it's not easy to write a single text about something for which people have deeply differing beliefs, like creationism versus evolution. It takes a lot of work. One of the things you see when you zoom in on these debates is how much norms, in this case, these are all references to various norms like no original research, assume good faith, etc. What people are doing is they argue by asserting norms, but at the same time, by the fact that the way that they argue is not just reverting, but asserting norms, is that we say we're part of the same community, bound by the same norms. We all, at the end of the day, want to do what we're doing together. From the perspective of, again, taking these stories and turning them into design, what Wikipedia gives us is a way in which you see the norms and the ability to be a normative community embedded in the design. And the design is not only technical, but also social, where the way in which you negotiate a conflict is by throwing norms back and forth at each other. We care about what's fair, which again doesn't mean just one thing, doesn't mean one equal. Let me tell you one story, just so you don't think it's all technical. This is from the cement industry. Cement? You're going in cement? Cement. So this is, the standard model would say that if you pay drivers more based on whether they're good or less if they're not good, they'll be better than if you pay everyone the same or just based on seniority. That's the standard prediction. If you pay for performance, you get better performance. It turns out from this study of the cement trucking moving industry in the US that that's not true. What matters is the fit between the theory of justice that the firm has and the actual payment. If the firm says to its employees, they're all drivers, you all do similar work, we're all people who need something, everyone has a flat scale, everybody earns the same. And that's what it does, performance measures are excellent. If the firm says people should be paid according to whether they work hard or not, that's also a theory of justice we know and recognize. They do well as well. What doesn't work is when the firm does one thing and says the other, or says one thing and does the other. That can't be explained for human beings who only care about whether they make a lot of money or a little money. It can only be explained in terms of people who actually accept a theory of justice in the workplace and then see a fit, an authentic fit between what the firm does and what the firm says. It's a very different view of what human beings care about. Let me tell two last stories from a study we did on music and get ready to close. People also just care about doing what's normal and adjust what they see to doing about normal. So here is data that we collected from a site called Magnitude in the US, which for a very long time allowed people to download music for a price. But once the music was downloaded, it was available at the Creative Commons and they could share it freely, and it was technically available to share freely. So even the people who paid the minimum, nonetheless were actually paying more than they had to. Not more than they had to technically, obviously everybody could crack, more than they had to legally. It was permissible for them to share with each other. So any contribution here is voluntary. What's interesting for purposes of understanding conformism and what's normal is that when you look over 5 years of data, hundreds of thousands of transactions, when you get a drop-down menu, you see $8 there, it says typical. 48% of people, you see up there next to typical? 48% of people picked saying, I will pay what's typical, not what's minimum, and certainly not what's really minimum, which is 0, because it's legal and technically feasible to share. I will pay what's typical. Another 12% wanted to be better than average, another 5% wanted to be generous. What you'll notice that you'll see the anchoring effect is that 48.05 gave $8. 0.34% gave $8.5. Nothing is a stronger signal that what people are trying to do is orient themselves to doing what they consider to be normal in the situation. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is trust, and again connected to music. So this is a beautiful experiment about trust and reciprocity. It's a little bit like a prisoner's dilemma game. It's called a trust game. And in this experiment, the experimenter gives the first subject, let's say, $10. The first subject then gets to give the second subject anything, from 0 to 10. Whatever the first person gives the second, the experimenter then gives them 3 times more. And the second person can then just go home. Or they can give back to the first person. The standard model says the first person can't make the second person give them anything back. They have $10 in their pocket. If they give it all over, they might go home with nothing. They'll both be better off if he gives it all over, the experimenter triples it, and of the $40, each one goes home with 20. But the unique prediction of game theory is that the first person won't trust, will go home with 10, and the second person will go home with 0. In standard experiments, we see that actually people give about half, and people return back about the appropriate amount. What happened here is that the experiment said to the first person, in addition to transferring the money, you can say, if you don't give me back half, or 60%, or 30%, I will punish you. I will spend more money so that you don't take home money. Again, the prediction of the model is simple, unique. If you threaten, you'll get more money back because the other person won't want to suffer the penalty. If you don't threaten, you'll get less money back. Reality as a force, the opposite. The people who received the biggest transfers back were the people who had the power to punish, but said in advance, no matter what you do, I won't punish, but I'd like my fair share. Those are the people up here, the super trusting. The people who did worst were the people who demanded a lot, were experienced as greedy, and threatened, if you don't give me a lot, I'll punish you. The people were willing to accept punishment, and they gave them the least. Here you have trust and reciprocity interacting in an experimental setting, showing us again something very specifically that we can begin to build on. Expressing trust and vulnerability in a context where you can do something else elicits very strong reciprocity back. What does that look like in the real world? Well, some of you may remember that Prince several years ago began suing fans for trying to make all sorts of mashups. What was interesting was the fans said they called it censorship. You had the battle back and forth. And this is a typical battle. We see it from piracy warnings, and then of course we see the opposite signal saying piracy, we'll take piracy. Sometimes the industry itself doesn't know whether it likes pirates or doesn't like pirates. It's sort of really bad to tell kids, if you do this, you'll be pirates. And being a pirate is such a cool thing. Oh well. There has to be a better way. And one of the examples, early experiment was 9 Inch Nails, releasing the inevitable rise and liberation of Niggy Stardust under pay what you want model. And it was considered a complete failure. Only 18% of people contributed anything. But actually when you look at the revenues, the artist would have had to sell $1 million in sales to make the same amount, given how much the recording industry takes. So it turns out that this tiny little failure of 18% was a success, and in fact, Reznor continues to do this, continues to release under all sorts of mechanisms, including inviting users to remix, inviting fans to remix the site. So part of the same study we did with Magnitude was looking at other, not at these famous musicians, but at relatively sort of the middle class of musicians. And here's one, Jonathan Colton, whose site implements so many of the design features we've talked about in an actual context, eliciting cooperation, where the cooperation here is essentially to say to the people who listen to the music, I'd like to make a living as a musician. I don't need to be a millionaire, but I'd like to make a living. And if you love my music, this is something we can do together. So one of the things that it starts out, and this is why it's here in Trust, is the music is released in perfect format, under Creative Commons license. It's completely legal to copy it and distribute it to friends, but it's in a context where you can actually pay for it. There's a strong sense of connection. I am not forcing you. Here, I'm going to make a joke about it. Already stole it? Sure. Here, you can donate for a banana or a robot or a monkey. We can do this together. Demand me. You tell me where I'll come perform. You tell me where to come and perform. I'll come and perform. And finally, instead of like Prince smashing down the remixes, it's actually, here's what you've done with my work. Let me show you the things I love most that you do. This human connection of building a community, of creating together with the fans. And so here's more or less what it looks like to conclude.
I quit my day job a little over a year ago, buying software, and
So this is basically him singing, and on the background all sorts of...
I'm joking. You should all quit your jobs tomorrow. It's fantastic.
On the background,
It works out.
various videos that fans made.
Anyway, so I wrote this song about my experiences as a software designer. This is called Code Monkey. Code Monkey, get up, get coffee. Code Monkey, go to job. Code Monkey, have boring meeting. Boring manager Rob. Rob say Code Monkey very diligent, but his output stinks. His code not functional or elegant. What does Code Monkey think? Code Monkey think